Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. I'm Jack Tolbert, and we're here to discuss the future of the public affairs profession in Wales. And I'm very, very happy to say that I'm in Cardiff and I'm joined by Joseph Carter, who is the head of the Devolved Nations at Asthma Lung UK. Joseph, welcome to the episode.
Thank you, Dioc. Thank you for having me.
Dioc and Val. Joseph, we are going to get into the future of public affairs, and we're going to start with you, if that's okay. My research suggests that you've been working in public affairs here in Wales for over 20 years in roles at the Liberal Democrats, as well as the MS Society, the British Lung Foundation, and your current role, of course. Are you okay to talk us through how things have evolved, things have changed in that time?
Yes, more than happy to, and it's great to be here. So thank you for having me and taking the time to ask these questions. So I think during that time, things have changed a lot. And I think the public affairs landscape in Wales has certainly has grown in maturity and skill. When I started in 2004, working first in the Senedd before becoming a bona fide lobbyist back in 2008, the lobbying scene was still fairly new. Pre-devolution, there was no Welsh lobbying sector. The powers of the old Wales office and MPs around it were relatively small in comparison, and we didn't have that rich history that Scotland had of the all-powerful Scotland office of paid lobbyists there. So it's evolved a lot. So I've seen a number of organisations who've been able to afford to have public affairs people or whole teams of people in some cases increase. It's been great to see a variety of companies working in this space as well, supporting charities like ours and others. It's an interesting mesh of private and voluntary sector lobbyists working alongside even some public sector lobbyists and people like trade unions who themselves are active lobbyists. So I think the sector has changed a lot and mainly for the better. I think we've evolved, as indeed the lobbying sector has across the UK. We've become more sophisticated in the sorts of things that we do. So when I started, and it was very much all about in-person gatherings and big expensive events, and equally there was an informality with some people that you could even approach a special advisor and try to get a quick coffee with them or something. It's become a lot more difficult to have those meetings because special advisors are a lot busier and there are more rules around it now. But actually the advent of the post-pandemic world has opened up a whole variety of opportunities for the sector to do things that aren't necessarily as big and expensive as they used to be, and certainly it's become a lot easier for us to do virtual events as well as in-person events. It's become easier for us to do things like the Senedd Marketplace at the moment, where you can have a stand alongside other organisations, and it's like a party conference exhibition space in many ways, and you can see MSs in that sort of space, and those are free. And the advent of virtual hybrid activity means it's a lot easier for us to get service users, healthcare professionals, real people from the constituencies to take part in things, which in the past was always a barrier, that regardless of what charity you worked in, it was quite difficult to get real people from, say, northeast Wales to be there to actually meet that MS in person, because that would take a whole day off work for that sort of experience. Now, with the click of a button, you can match up that politician with that real person, and that's better for the politician, and it's better for the charities and other third sector organisations as well.
Joseph, thank you. I'm really intrigued around the hybrid working now. As you correctly point out, the pandemic has changed the way we work. Things are arguably less personal, but I think that is still relatively subjective depending on which lens you're looking through. There are obvious benefits of hybrid working, which you've very clearly articulated. The one thing I want to pick up based on what you were saying was just around the in-person dynamic now. Back in the day, or things used to be very much everything was in person, and it has evolved based on where we are with technology and things like the pandemic, etc. In terms of face-to-face being more difficult now, can you talk us through kind of what that means in a practical sense? And does that just mean access to MSs, or does it also mean access to special advisors, civil servants, etc.? Really, really intrigued to hear your thoughts around that.
I think that's an interesting question. So I think it depends what you're looking for. So I was talking about being more challenging to say meet a special advisor than it used to be. I was more reflecting on how busy the sector is, and actually the competition out there, because also the marketplace of organisations is greater. So that's obviously means you have to shout louder and try to sell yourself in a special way to get that meeting, and to rely on those personal connections that you may well have established over many years. But in terms of those meetings, I mean, I think it has made politicians more accessible. So nowadays, it's not unusual to be able to meet an MS on a Monday or a Friday if you're doing it virtually. Whilst that was always been no before, you could only meet the MS on a day when they were in the Senate in person on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, or Thursday morning actually, because by Thursday afternoon most are hot-footing it back to their constituencies or regions. So now there is the possibility of having those meetings on other days as well, which is great, particularly if it's recess as well, and the politician is very interested and wants to make contact. But it can lead to a variety of different increases the number of meetings and things happening at the same time, which sadly, with only 60 MSs at the moment, it does make it quite challenging to get people to things. So before the pandemic, the number of events you would have at any one time be limited by the physical space. It'd be limited by the number of committee rooms that could be booked. You might have 2 or 3 cross-party group type meetings at the same time, as well as having one big event in the Oriole or in the NAV, or possibly in the Pierhead. But normally you couldn't have both at the same time. So that was that limited number of things that MSs could go to, and they're obviously all under demand as well. Plus, they might need to prepare for plenary directly afterwards. Might need to eat, God forbid. So actually, they might not want to come to events anyway. So, but at least you are limited by that. Now you might have a whole series of different virtual meetings going on at the same time as well. Virtual cross-party groups. You might have people seeking to meet one particular MS. You might even have people having a protest outside, or informal lobbying activity outside the Senate, which attracts their attention as well. So I think it is a busier space, and that does add to the challenges there. Certainly, I don't find personally that it affects my ability, but most people I know, to lobby, whether you're meeting someone virtually or in person. I mean, that may be a personal preference, and I think some people have found that challenging if they feel less comfortable in a virtual setting. But I've certainly found that my whole skill set has adapted to being a very active virtual lobbyist as well as an in-person one. But it does mean you're always up against other activities. On the civil servant front, I think it has made it easier to meet with civil servants, because now you can meet with civil servants and they would pull in people from across their team who might not necessarily be based in Cardiff, who might actually be based exclusively home based, or might be based semi in the office in North Wales or in West Wales. They would never be able to attend a meeting back in the old days, or if they did, it would be a massive waste of their time potentially to come to meet you for half an hour. Now with the click of a button, they can be there as well. And I think, and that's bizarre it sounds, that if you're having one-to-one meetings of a civil servant and it's just you and them on a screen together, there is a sense of privacy there that if you're in the busy sprawling space of Cathays Park and you've kind of grabbed a corner somewhere, or you're sitting in a room where there are other civil servants nearby, you didn't necessarily feel that intimacy or privacy that were before. So I think it swings and roundabouts, but certainly we found it a very different environment, a very engaging environment. Some MSs clearly have a preference for in-person meetings, and which is their preference. So sometimes we might offer a virtual meeting, and they will say, "Oh, rather be in person." That might possible. It might not, depending on our availability. And we know there are certain MSs who are quite maybe negative about virtual cross-party groups, because they don't see it as meaningful as them walking around and seeing people who are actually physically in the Senate building. But that being said, pre-pandemic, I have plenty of memories of attending a cross-party group in person where we'd all travelled quite a long time to get there for it, and there might be only one politician there, and that's the person who's sponsoring it. And so we have plenty of those experiences virtually, and we did in person before. So it swings around about.
I get the impression, listening to you and assessing your body language, that you prefer the hybrid working. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you definitely seem to be very clear about the benefits of it. And as you rightly articulate, sometimes there's a lot of wastage kind of in a pre-pandemic world. Would you say that you're a fan of hybrid?
Yes, I am a fan of hybrid lobbying, and so I can't. And as someone who is home based, my organisation closed down its office in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland when the pandemic hit. I managed a relatively small team anyway across 2 different offices, and we'd have plenty of times where there might be one person in the office anyway. So we'd have 3 of us in the Wales office crammed into this broom cupboard space that was round the corner from the Senedd, and it was a good location, but it was was tiny. It was only when we talked to, when the idea of social distancing came along, we thought, my God, we're in this tiny matchbox of a space. What the hell are we doing? So I'm paying an awful lot of rent for the privilege of doing that. So it's obviously different if you're a much bigger organization, you know, a big charity with loads of staff. It makes sense to have an office, and our, you know, we've got a fairly, you know, reasonable size office in London where our staff where, you know, staff go in there 2 days a week, some cases more. But that dynamic wasn't necessarily necessary with a team as small as ours. So I've been working home base for 5 years, and I suppose I have become a bit of an evangelist for it, and maybe that works better for the sort of my time, my career, and how long I've been doing this, the age of my children, etc. It's quite different from a young lobbyist straight from university who might be in a shared flat or a shared house or something. That's a very different environment from a middle-aged, middle-class person living in their house on the 1960s Cardiff suburbia. So that's very, you know, so I get that everyone's different, but no, I think it works very well. And I have plenty of examples where I would actually, when I worked in the Senate, the amount of time that the researchers would spend going downstairs, meeting a lobbyist, bring them upstairs, would like a cup of tea, coffee, yes, go and get that person a drink, you know, providing catering for this person who's coming in, doing, you know, if you're having your meeting for half an hour and then shooing them out the door afterwards, and that would be the amount, that would be the routine, that would be the amount of time that would be taken, always going into the sort of private space of a politician, and that's how it was. But nowadays, even with the in-person meetings, the culture has changed so that most MSs that we meet in person, we meet in the Senate cafe, in the Senate actual building itself, in the public space of the Senate. So actually, even for the in-person meetings, the actual time of a researcher, you know, going up and down the stairs and getting drinks and things is thankfully long gone. And it's like musical chairs where you have the politician will be sat down on a table in the public space, meeting a lobbyist like myself, and then at a certain time, then going to the next person, like speed dating almost, and going around. And I've even had an MS sit down on one occasion and start talking to me, assuming I was there to talk about one thing, and then realizing no, I wasn't the person he was looking for. But because he recognized me and knew me, assumed he was meeting me. I said, no, I'm not meeting you, which was fine because I got to have the engagement, so that was good. But it wasn't what he wanted. So even the in-person dynamic has changed a lot. So I think it is evolving all the time. I think it's better than it used to be in terms of that. And don't get me wrong, I'm definitely someone who enjoys a party conference and enjoys actually having a stand and enjoys doorstepping people at a conference and asking people to hold our boards up and have a quick photo and trying to accost the politician in the bar afterwards or that sort of thing, and having that relationship that is important, and I certainly value that. But in terms of the normal meetings we have with politicians and the business we have with them, and the hybrid model seems to work very well, I believe.
That's really good. Thank you. We are going to talk about AI in a little bit. Before we get there, can I just ask your thoughts on, or maybe your reflections on, how else the profession has changed in your time over the last 20 years or so?
Well, I think one area it has changed has been is always the churn in politics, the way things have when how parties are doing. We look obviously with a degree of interest, possible concern about the prospect of a group of reform MSs being elected. I remember I've worked through the period when UKIP were here last time, and it was an experience, and you know, a bit daunting at first, but actually we got through it as lobbyists. Many of us had good relationships with individual UKIP MSs, and actually could find specific ones very helpful on our causes. So I remember at one point the climate change committee being chaired by a UKIP MS, and we were a bit daunted by that, but he was very interested in the work we were pushing about air pollution at that point on an individual basis, and was very helpful to us. So that's been interesting. We've seen times of obviously Plaid Cymru Labour coalition last time that happened, and that was and as a lobbyist, I have to say, in that situation when you had such a large majority government, it was quite limiting for us, because actually it meant that our work of opposition parties didn't have as much impact as before, that actually, if it wasn't on Labour or Plaid Cymru's agenda, it wasn't going to happen. And we are so used in Wales to the idea of there being a relatively slim majority government. Actually, suddenly having this big majority government was quite challenging. So it's been interesting seeing how things have progressed over time and how politics ebbs and flows, seeing the different characters moving in and out, and the different lobbying companies popping up. So I think one other thing that has changed, which has been great, has been the professionalism of the sector by our trade body, by Public Affairs Cymru. So that's come on leaps and bounds pounds in recent years and has got more professional, and it varies depending on how popular the events are. But certainly as a peer supporting organisation, that is a very useful one. And I certainly recommend any Welsh lobbyist listening to this to be a member of Public Affairs Cymru, and a lot of credit I would give to the current chair, Emma Henwood from Sport Wales. But we've also, in the last 2 years, seen the advent of a public affairs women's group being set up. That obviously I can't take part in being a male lobbyist, but it's been great to see more women being in that space, because it was very male when I first started in 2004, and actually it's probably more balanced now, if not in some cases more women. So that's a positive thing, and a lot less people who are definitely bona fide party members of different colours as well. A lot more people who at least claim on the surface to be independent. So whether that's true or not is debatable. But it's interesting that actually the sector has broadened. So you haven't just got to work for an MS or possibly work for an MP and come across. Actually, you could come from a university, then go for the ranks of working for a lobbying agency, and then come through that way, rather than or gaining your experience via a charitable route, not necessarily just being you have to be a researcher for a party first. And that again broadens the expertise and ideas as well.
Absolutely. I think what you say there around the different groups, and particularly the women's group, is really good to see, and it's really, really good to hear. I think having, broadly speaking, more diversity in the sector is got to be good for everybody. It's going to be more representative. So it's really, really good to see. And one of the things you spoke about at the start of that was a bit about the dynamic with UKIP, and you mentioned the positive relationships that were gained with individuals. And I think that there's probably something to be said about that relationship side and about putting the work in, given the landscape where we are now, where we might be in a year's time or so, which we will cover a bit later on. So it's really, really interesting to hear how things have ebbed and flowed, as you say, because 20 years or so, things do change kind of across the board, but also politics can be relatively cyclical as well. So it's really good to reflect on that. So thank you, Joseph. We are going to move on and talk about tech and AI. So we ask all of our guests, broadly speaking, how has tech evolved in their public affairs experience, and what impact do you think AI is going to have on public affairs here in Wales?
I think that is a fascinating question, and one that I'm wrestling with as much as anyone else. In my own work, I don't feel that AI has affected the way that we are lobbying as of yet, and actually the monitoring that we are getting, at least from our perspective, that is possibly because our charity has been slightly cautious about purchasing different technologies, and like everyone else, we are looking at this. I know our board have been considering AI packages, etc., but as of yet haven't really implemented them. So some charities are in a different space to ours, and I was talking to another health charity recently, actually following the S&P conference when you and I last saw each other, where we are comparing notes about their AI experience. So we don't use it much ourselves, but I am in awe often when I'm in meetings with people and I can see they have a virtual note taker, because I hate taking minutes of meetings, and we're not a massive organisation, so whenever I'm chairing a meeting, I'm often the one also taking the minutes from it as well. It's never a great use of I'm often conscious it's not the best use of my time to spend ages writing these minutes afterwards. That's why obviously why the tech is so important. So when I see an organisation or company having this technology to hand, I think, wow, that's a few hours work just done straight away in the click of a button, which I'm very impressed by. I know that some of the monitoring that we obviously have from yourselves obviously has a degree of AI generation in it as well. And I know that other companies work in the space also use AI to kind of trawl through the records proceedings and monitoring a set of questions, etc. Using AI for that, which obviously speeds that process up. And for those of us who are using your packages and others, that's obviously very useful and hopefully is obviously reflected in the good value for money we all get as well. So I think it's definitely got its place for that as well. But on the other hand, I can certainly see the concerns and worries that people have. Particularly, I think of people who are trying to get into this sector. So I maybe before about the idea of people being able to get into this sector by not working for a party first. Some of those entry-level jobs actually might be someone who's worked for a lobbying agency and is sat there listening to every debate, writing notes, quite grueling work, but work we all appreciate. And if that job isn't there anymore, that straight from university graduate job, not paid the best, but giving good experience, if that's not there anymore, then actually what does that mean for those individuals? Do they go to a different sector? Do we lose that next wave of talent coming up from the bottom, as it were, from university upwards? So I can see if you have if you're a charity organisation with a team of lobbyists rather than necessarily just one person in Wales, if you utilise the right technology package, and you might be looking at a workforce, you might be struggling financially, with fundraising might be down, and you might think, well, actually, I could be purchasing that using AI a bit more for this, and maybe I need one person rather than two. Then suddenly that's a job gone, which might be the most financial sense for the organisation. But again, the human cost of that is the challenge as well. And I do worry about that. I worry about people trying to enter the sector, potentially being pushed out of a role because of that. And then I suppose putting my specific charity hat on, we'd love work in the air pollution space. We obviously do a lot of work with other environmental charities as well. We do worry about the environmental cost of massive amounts of AI. I mean, particularly with the impact on water and electricity use, power required for this. We're pushing for you want to see more, electricity generated power rather than electricity being used rather than, say, gas or coal. We want to have a greener environment. We want to see more solar panels being used, EVs over diesel cars, etc. That all requires electricity, and if we rely on vast amounts of data hubs to power this AI, does that slow down our green transition? I don't know. So does that increase the cost to us as consumers? I mean, I don't. That's a question I wonder as well. So lots of different, competing things go around my mind when it comes to AI. But I am conscious that I feel a bit of a Luddite about it. And actually, one of the things I've raised internally with my own charity in terms of HR is how do we make sure that staff are not falling behind, that actually we're not actually potentially damaging the skills of our staff by withholding tech from them if they maybe move on and go elsewhere. And like most organisations, our staff pool in Wales is relatively static, and people might stay for a few years, but our staff in London, where the lobbying market is more fluid, might stay for a lot less, and we don't want our staff to miss out on opportunities because they're not being able to use the technology. If everyone else is using AI to generate briefing papers and they're not, how do we do that? And we've seen that challenge internally with Canva, which I know has a degree of AI in it, and that actually with a charity we don't use it corporately, but actually lots of people want to use it and have that creativity with AI backing, which they can't otherwise. So I think there are lots of pros and cons for this, but and I'm conscious of my inability to use ChatGPT, and my 16-year-old daughter and 13-year-old son are very good at making me feel very stupid when it comes to AI, because they can use this stuff and use this stuff in college all the time, and I'm sat there working a charity not using it. So it's an interesting change of pace for us all, and I do think we can't ignore it, and charities clearly don't want to fall behind.
I've just had a thought that maybe the 16 and the 13-year-old might be the next wave of talent in public affairs in Wales. Maybe you could start outsourcing some of the work to them and count it as work experience. But there is a serious point to this, and I want to talk about talent, because this is something I'm really interested in, and I've discussed this in varying degrees with different guests that we've had on the podcast. The points you raise about skills and development, I think, are very, very significant here, because if professionals aren't getting the skills, if they're not getting the development opportunities, if they're not able to get the level of experience necessary, then that is going to have an impact somewhere along the line here. Now, whether that's one of these impacts that we don't see for 5 years or 10 years, that is a possibility. For everyone's benefit that's listening to this, Joseph and I actually come from the same place. We've ended up in Cardiff today through very different routes, but ultimately we both grew up around Worcester, which is in the West Midlands, so very near to the Welsh border. I've kind of come into politics via the London route, and Joseph, you've been in Wales for a number of years. But I do have a concern about how people get into this profession moving forward, because if there isn't necessarily the entry level jobs and opportunities, how are we going to encourage young people to get into public affairs politics? Because it's not the most linear path anyway. If you do politics at university, definitely at my time, there wasn't a very clear kind of open door to say, well, you can go and do this now. You kind of had to find your own way.
No, you did, and I think to an extent you probably still do. But I mean, I think if you go to university in Cardiff or any of the universities in London, then you're going to be more aware of the opportunities available to you working in public affairs, or maybe you've gone in via a political party. But as you rightly say, that is if those roles aren't there, if we're not necessarily recruiting those people straight from university, then that is going to be a barrier, and it is going to possibly create this generational divide in the sector where you've got people who've been there a long time, and versus this empty space where the graduates would be who are no longer there because of tech doing their jobs. So I think we'll have to see what happens. It is, but clearly, public affairs sector can't ignore the trends that are going on, and they particularly the companies that we rely on in a marketplace and are looking at what's out there and utilising it very well. And if we're not evolving, if we stand still, we fall behind. And I think every charity finds that. But I think it's also about the interaction between that tech and the politicians we're seeking to influence. So we talked about the importance of building relationships up, whether it's virtual in person, but it's ultimately about trying to sell yourself and your charity to that individual and making yourself well known and so people recognize the kind of the brand of your charity, your personal brand potentially as well, and really buy into the emotional connection of what you're trying to say as a charity. But actually, if you're in a space where we can throw together lots of different emails and briefings via AI and the click of a button and bombarding politicians like that, does that make it less personal? Does that make it more difficult for an individual lobbyist to shine, to break through, if we just create lots of noise? And if we are in a situation where we are using AI to create big reports, which then sent off, and then a politician and their staff needs to use AI to summarize said reports and to actually create it back into something readable, you have to ask them, what's the point? What's the point of making the big report if your sign was something small and then politician X is ending up with something small at the end of it? Why create the big report in the middle in the first place and to use AI to do it with all the heat and water being required to do that? I mean, you have to wonder these things, don't you, sometimes? But I do appreciate that the ecosystem in Wales is still quite different from Westminster, that actually MPs are being bombarded with an awful lot more stuff, a lot more noise, a lot more lobbying than politicians here in Wales. And maybe this will make us more of a level playing field, in that we won't have the same relationships with politicians in Wales that we've relied on, because they'll just be busier and more bombarded by stuff. I don't know, but I know that politicians will moan about the amount of generic emails they have, of generic stuff, and that's even when it's generic emails sent by real people that we've encouraged to email them via an e-action. That's a real constituent sending a real email. It just happens to be 1,000 different emails sent by 1,000 different people, which is almost the same email. But it's still, for the politician, they're looking at it thinking, it's another one of those. But those are real people. If you're using AI to do that, and maybe are bombarding them, maybe you're a private company bombarding politicians with bots rather than real people, does that cloud out the actual the lobbying of an individual lobbyist? I don't know. So it's a very strange space. But I'm interested to see where it goes. I certainly personally don't want to fall behind, and it's important for all of us to always adapt and try to keep up with technology.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of known unknowns, and there are going to be some unknown unknowns. My thoughts on this are that we're probably not going to know the unknown unknowns until they probably hit us all in the face. But let's hope we can all communicate when we do reach them. We're going to move on a little bit and look ahead to next year and the elections. So for the benefit of the listeners, we are recording on Budget Day, and it's the 26th of November. So very much looking ahead to the elections next year. Obviously, the elections here in Cardiff in the Senedd and in Holyrood in Scotland, they are of huge significance in their own right. There is also another layer of context with these elections in relation to performance of the UK government. I would really like to understand what your thoughts are on the elections next year. If you have any hot tips or hot takes, maybe some potential outcomes that you may even be scenario planning. Really interested to get your take on it, Joseph.
No, it's going to be an exciting once-in-a-generation election in Wales, in the same way that the 2007 was that generational change in Scotland. So there is a possibility that between now and May, in the next 6 months, that we might see a dramatic change in fortunes for Welsh Labour. But as time goes on, that looks increasingly unlikely. And even if the Prime Minister was to fall on his sword and resign suddenly, I don't think that would necessarily make a massive change to the situation that we're in. There's a degree of frustration out there, and I think that is building up, and people are choosing to embrace other parties, be them of the left or the right. And I think that's a real challenge for Welsh Labour. As a challenge for lobbyists and anyone in the public sector as well who've got used to a specific way of working, i.e. the way that there's Labour are always in charge. So that is potentially a big change. As for charities, I think it's a huge opportunity. I mean, it's we always need to be lobbying every party. That's the democratic thing to do. Even if you suspect the way it's going to go, you need to be at least trying to engage with all parties. But this is the first time ever that we've seen the possibility of a real dramatic change there. So it makes it even more exciting to be lobbying. And particularly if you've got the Welsh Government consulting on things right now, which aren't going to happen until after the election, making sure that you are working with other parties and saying, well, actually, if you're in government, then maybe you could be doing, then you could take forward these issues for us and be doing policy X rather than policy Y. So that's very exciting. But yeah, looking at the numbers though, I mean, all the polls would suggest that we are looking at a Plaid Cymru and Reform being the two biggest parties, possibly neck and neck, possibly one bigger than the other one, but broadly the same. But the reality is that it's quite difficult to see a situation where there will be enough Reform and Conservative MSs to make a majority in the Senate. Then there's no way that the Liberal Democrats or the Greens, if they had MSs, would vote with them anyway. So that just seems a non-starter. And for any growth in Reform, it tends to come at the cost of the Conservatives. So that seems unlikely. On the other hand, on the other side, there's that dynamic with Labour and Plaid Cymru to an extent, although the numbers would suggest that a Plaid Cymru Labour government together could make a majority, and hopefully that outcome will give some sort of stability to Wales. But there are other scenarios where you could see a Welsh Democrat or Green combination go to that as well to add to the numbers, depending on whether those parties, how they do in the elections as well. We just don't know. So, but I suppose another challenge to that, we're all making an assumption in the sector that Labour would be happy to come in as number two. Now, there are, as you're aware, historically, a UK-wide Labour's position on these things has been in councils as well. That they shouldn't be in coalitions if they're not the biggest party. So we're all assuming that Labour would be happy to be number two. But if they're not, what does that mean for us? Because then, does that mean a situation where could a Plaid Cymru minority government be a possibility? Would Labour be happy to vote with them on a confidence and supply basis, alongside possibly other parties? Would that be stable enough to us to actually survive? SNP showed that could be possible. They worked that very well in the 2007 to 2011 term. So there's a model there to be followed, but that would lead to a huge uncertainty out there. So my money would be on either a Plaid Cymru minority or some sort of Plaid Cymru Welsh Labour coalition. I think the options on the right are far less likely, but we need to prepare for all eventualities. And actually, it's not just about who's in government. It's also about who's got the committee chairs, who's going to be in positions of power. And clearly, a Reform group coming from nowhere, coming from one MS via defection into suddenly a large group in the 30s, that's going to be a huge change. That creates interesting opportunities for lobbyists, both private and third sector, to get to know these politicians, to offer assistance, to be helpful, to help coach and provide support for people who actually have no experience in public affairs working in politics before. So that could be an interesting opportunity for people. And some of these people will be getting important roles in the regular Senate. So it's an exciting time to be a lobbyist. It's a nerve-wracking time to be a citizen, being someone living here, thinking about who's going to be running my government, who's going to be actually running my health service, etc. It's a scary thing as a citizen to be thinking about. And if you work as a civil servant, it must be kind of really kind of nail-biting times. But as a lobbyist, it's very exciting, and I think there will be opportunities out there. I think it is about making relationships, though. So yeah, very, very excited. I suppose in terms of advice I would give is that we've obviously got a new electoral system as well. So this is we're going from 60 to 96 MSs. We're going to this party list system with 6 MSs from each of the new super constituencies. So that's a big change for us. And we've got party lists, so we will know exactly who's on what place of the list. What I would say is that, whilst you might take the view as a charity that meeting all candidates is wonderful, so therefore if you're meeting the number 4 candidate on the Labour list, then that's a tick on your KPIs, and therefore it's a positive thing. But realistically, that's, for lobbying purposes going forward, that's not very useful. You want to be thinking about who's top of the lists, who's number 1 and 2 in each party. Certainly number 1 and 2 in Plaid Cymru and Reforms, same with possibly Labour. With the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and Greens, we're looking at number 1s there, and number 1s crucially in the seats where they are definitely working as well. So ultimately this season is about trying to firstly, get our ideas in party manifestos. And that's work that most of you have already done that already. And if you haven't, it's probably getting a bit too late anyway. So this is the time now to be doing that bit behind the scenes. But then we get into the actual campaigning period. It's about making contacts with those candidates, making relationships now with those important people, so that when they do get elected, you've already got your foot in the door and you've already had that contact. And that might mean that it is going to require you trying to meet people in their constituencies, because they won't be, obviously, the kind of virtual work you might do once you're elected wouldn't necessarily work. You know, physically going to meet them is really important. Using the conferences where they are attending is very important as well. But making those friends now, because if you're the person who gets recognised and you've got your brand out there as a charity or a company out there with that candidate before the election, and then suddenly they are elected and find themselves as chair of the health committee, for example, in my case, then actually that person's going to have some knowledge of your work. They're going to be thinking about the things that you sold them on when you met them. And they might, at least for that moment in time, think that the issues that you're talking about are more significant than the rest of the noise that they're hearing. So yeah, certainly don't sit back and wait until May to find out what happens. And we should be proactive as lobbyists, trying to engage people now, utilising the party conferences and making new friends.
Just a quiet 6 months ahead then.
Yes.
That's a fantastic outline of the next 6 months or so, and the recommendations you make are completely logical and make complete sense. And we'll wait and see, obviously, how things pan out. But what you have suggested is incredibly insightful. So thank you, Joseph. We're going to move on to some slightly lighter questions before we finish, which, for the benefit of the listeners, I haven't briefed Joseph on. So we'll find out what we learn. The first question is, what is your single one non-negotiable piece of advice for someone who's maybe starting out their public affairs career here in Wales today?
Well, I think the key thing is to be very flexible and to be prepared to try to make as many friends and allies across the political divide as possible. You might be coming to the sector working for a political party. In my background, working for the Welsh Liberal Democrats prior to coming this role. Having to leave politics at the door and make friends in other parties was something that I knew from the off and have worked very hard on. So that is so significant. So that doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily mean you have no principles, don't get me wrong, but it is about trying to, distance yourself from the politics of the situation, because if you can't work with all parties, then actually it's a non-starter. And you tend to get things that tend to find themselves working with only one political party tend to be on the fringes. And actually that unless that party is all powerful, and maybe in a Westminster situation with a party with a majority, then actually if you've got friends in one party and they're in government, then it's fine. But in the Welsh public affairs sector, you need to be able to work with all parties, have allies across all parties, and that's the way of getting things done.
Very good advice, thank you. Party conferences has come up a little bit in our discussion today. We obviously met in Aberdeen 6 weeks, 2 months ago, or whenever it was, which was good. My second question is, what is your favourite, or maybe what is your best party conference story?
That's an interesting situation to be in. So yes, I love party conference. I love going around meeting people at party conferences, and they're all very different sort of cultures. I work across the Devolved Nations, and I always and each nation has its own kind of different way of doing conferences. But my favourites more recently have been the Scottish Labour conferences, and maybe it's because it's a party that have not been in power for a while and have been on the up until recently anyway, and a very large membership. But they tend to be very good at looking after lobbyists. So we've gone along there. We've had hosted stands. They've had a specific reception just for stand holders, separate to everyone else, where the party leader Anna Sawar has come round and talked to us all. Disco last time round, which was sponsored by Octopus Energy, where we all walked away with free octopus teddies, which made me very popular, as I managed to stuff 2 as my pockets to give to the kids. They love that. But my favourite story came as a result of that when someone I know in work in the public affairs sector had inadvertently had a bit of a road rage instance with the Labour leader, and he just happened to mention it to him as he was going around the stands out of embarrassment, because he thought he recognised him. Actually, Anna Sawar did not recognise this person. He wasn't aware it was him, but he remembered the incident. And then we got to the we got to the lobbyist reception, and he mentions it in the reception and just exposed the individual, and everyone had a good laugh about it. It was hilarious, and everyone thought it was best gag of it. And they went to the disco later on. He did exactly the same thing again. Even more people got to hear the story, and it was good and refreshing that a leader could be so fun and casual with the lobbyists, having a good sort of laugh with them, and actually and made us feel very welcome. And maybe that was all about the charm offensive because we were paying to be there, of course. But it felt nice as lobbyists to be welcome. As you know, in your neck, in your work, there's nothing more frustrating than when you've paid to go to a conference and actually you feel ignored by the politicians. You feel they don't come around the stands. I'm sure we've all had experiences in all parties where you've had your stand. You'll see the politicians walk backwards and forwards. You're kind of smiling, sort of waving, trying to possibly doorstepping them, but you can't go too far from your stand, and actually they're ignoring you. And and if you've paid a lot of money to be there, it's very frustrating. But even just for the time, it's frustrating as well. So I think we all expect that if we paid to be there, actually, and pay for that access, actually the politicians, whether it's leadership or the backbenchers, the least they should do is actually walk around and talk to us. So yeah, so that was so him being so engaging was wonderful. But I have to say, Linda Morgan last year going down the disco route herself as DJ was very entertaining as well.
Very good. My next question is, who has been your favourite First Minister?
Well, I think my favourite First Minister from professional capacity in recent years has been Mark Drakeford. So probably the biggest political success I've had in my lobbying career has been what became the Environment Act 2024, the Environment, Air Quality and Soundscape Act, which was originally the Clean Air Bill. So that was a promise that Mark Drakeford made when he was running to become First Minister, when he was going to become leader of the Labour Party. He, within a year of us making the call for it and building a cross-party consensus, he came on board quite early on and said, I will do this. And he delivered that. So from in terms of my work and my profession, because of his boldness and his belief and passion in tackling air pollution, which was our passion, to have someone on board like that was so important, and it was a real career highlight for me to actually to get along to be invited to the Royal Ascent sealing ceremony, which is held in the Welsh Government Building, where a selected group of people, mainly civil servants, gather with the First Minister and the relevant minister for the mechanical wax sealing process, where the actual wax seal with the King's Royal Patent is put on the act. And myself and my colleague Harv Elgar, who's the Vice Chair of Healthier Cymru, were invited to join them for that process, and that was and were referenced and name dropped during it and thanked for our support. And as part of that great engagement, that also been wonderful seeing the work come on since. So that was, from a career point of view, really important. But obviously, from working more generally and spiritually, the man who took us through the pandemic and tried to keep people safe during this time. And yes, there were mistakes, clearly, and the COVID inquiry has found that out, and that's been good to have that openness, and we gave evidence towards that. But it was a very challenging time, and actually to try to keep Wales moving, keep our health system functioning during that time was a huge, valiant effort. So yeah, Mark Drakeford's probably my favourite First Minister in Wales.
Thank you, Joseph. And the final question is, who do you think is a future First Minister?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, at the moment, the polls would suggest that Sri Ioif will be the future First Minister. So we will see what happens there. I mean, if it's not him, if you're looking at other parties, I mean, we'll have to. I mean, Labour, I think, it's be a huge changes ahead there in terms of leadership. I mean, a lot of the polls would have a Linda Morgan not winning her seat. So, but there's obviously lots of new blood coming down the horizon as well there. So it is a case of who's going to be left. I think that if the stars aligned in the right way, that Hugh Rankin-Davies could present himself as someone who was on the consensus building centre-ish kind of a position within the Welsh Labour Party, and if they're the biggest party and he was still there, that he could be in a position where he could be a First Minister and probably be a similar First Minister to a Linda Morgan right now. But I think certainly the polls would suggest that Trine would be the next First Minister. But there are obviously other talented people in Plaid Cymru, and we do a lot of good work with Mabel Map Gwynfor clearly on the health side, and Delith Joel as deputy leader, and all the work she does on the environment is so important to us as well. So we'll have to see. But I think that the polls are suggesting one man at this stage.
Joseph, thank you very much. It's been great having you on today's episode, and thank you for making the time to come and meet with me here in Cardiff. So my thanks to Joseph, my thanks as always to my colleague Ollie Foster, who's our in-house producer. Perhaps you have a view on the future of public affairs and the future of public affairs here in Wales, and you'd like to share or you'd like to add to the discussion yourself. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of De Havilland and Forefront.